450 people, government, business, all academics. What was fascinating to me about that day, the luncheon talk was given by the Chinese ambassador to the UK. And he said, you all worry about China and cybersecurity, but we're a victim too. We're a victim of hacking. And he talked about youth protection and things. So he set it up that way. That very afternoon, the Google representatives who were in the room announced that they had been hacked by the Chinese government. Yes. And to conclude the day, I was moderating a panel in the afternoon to focus on how we would apply the Geneva Protocols to cyber warfare. The Chinese representative in the room stood up and said, why do we need to address this at all? We should be talking about cyber cooperation. The next morning, we held a final China-related panel, and the title was Fighting Spam to Build Trust, which was a joint effort between American and Chinese industry workers. So please, what are your thoughts on US-China cybersecurity issues?
Well, I think that they cheat and steal a lot with the internet. And I think, you know, Jeff Bader, my colleague at Brookings, who came out of the Obama administration recently, wrote a book, and he quoted President Obama as saying, it's time that we threw a few more elbows with the Chinese economically. So that's the one point, maybe that's the one addendum to your point, Admiral, that, as you well know, there are some parts of the American business community that are happier than others with the US-China economic relationship. And I think we need to throw a few more elbows on some aspects of trade policy. I didn't mind the Romney-Obama debate on this. I didn't find it overly negative. I was glad that it didn't tend to go into military and strategic realms. It tended to stay on the economic side and tended to be what are the more effective, tough measures. And as we all know as well, ever since Nixon and Kissinger, you typically have a bad opening with China when you're a new American president. So if Romney had been elected after having said he was going to designate them a currency manipulator and go after some cyber security issues and so forth, he would have had a tough first year and sort of gotten it out of the way, and then we would have gone back to the three-year dynamic of improving relations, but hopefully with some net progress on this issue. I mean, I'm not an expert on cyber, so I'll just say a couple of things as I try to work through this. First of all, you do have to assume that any investment a Chinese firm is trying to make in an American company that has cyber-related implications, you got to be very nervous about. So I approve of playing tough with the Chinese on investment in the United States in technology domains. It's a, you know, it's a dangerous argument because it risks going too far, but the first approximation, we have to do that. Secondly, we've got to keep working, as I know DOD is trying to, on better forensics, and NSA obviously, better forensics, so we can, with this dialogue we have with the Chinese, remind them that there actually are ways to figure out who just hacked you. And by the way, we're doing it, and we've figured out that a lot of times it is you, our friends, either the Chinese government or more likely people in China acting one step removed, but probably with the blessing or at least the tolerance of the Chinese government. And we've got to make it harder on the Chinese to keep playing that double game with forensics and other means of attribution. And the third thing I would say, and there was a good report released yesterday, some of you probably saw, that we have to assume that not just from the Chinese, but from many around the world, our infrastructure is highly vulnerable. And with all due respect, we have to go back to the bill that was defeated last year, or last session of Congress, earlier this year, and we actually do need to mandate, I think, certain standards against cyber attack in our key infrastructure, because we're just too darn vulnerable. And that's not just because of China, it's because of other potential threats as well. Those are just three beginning points that barely begin to do justice to the important topic you raised.
Lynn Novak.
Thanks, Jim. Mike, we were talking a little earlier, and I brought up the point that I thought would be addressed in the two morning panels, but was not. And that is the issue of the increasing percentage of the defense budget that needs to be designated for cyber and space technology. And nobody's really talked about that yet. What kind of money is being spent, and how much is it going to be growing in our budgets?
And I should get a rule of order here. How many of the hardest questions am I allowed to put in the queue for David and company in the next panel? That's a great question, Lynn. There are various estimates about how much we spend on cyber and how much we spend on cyber defense or cyber offense. The net investment of the Department of Defense that has to do in one way or another with computers has got to be now well into the many tens of billions of dollars, a cumulative investment, and probably well beyond that. annual expenses that I've seen for cyber offense and cyber defense are in the low billions per year. But of course, it depends how you do the definition, because you could say virtually the entire National Security Agency budget is related to this topic in one way or another. And as for space, and of course we're all now talking discreetly and gently around the edges of issues where it's very hard to get unclassified numbers, but we also know that with space, we have an intelligence budget that every so often is revealed to be a certain number, and it seems to be close to 80 billion, and a fair amount of that is space assets. And then, of course, there's communications infrastructure on top of the intelligence. And so when you put it all together, space assets, just to answer your question in very, sort of accounting terms, are probably in the range of 20 to 40 billion a year annual expense by the Department of Defense, and quite possibly more. So I know you asked about the policy issues around space and cyber as well, but that could take us off in another direction, so I'll leave that for colleagues in a few minutes.
Christian Blackwell.
I am a long-standing advocate of free trade in order to, and globalization in order to preserve peace. And I take great comfort from the increase in global trade and globalization generally. But there's one thing that worries me, and it's Archduke Ferdinand. So my question is, looking back at the world in the run-up to World War I, what parallels do you see, what risks do you see that are similar, and what lessons would you take away in looking at the emergence of China as a great power with a parallel to Germany in World War I?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. I think the World War I analogy people dismiss too quickly because there are obviously limits to the analogy today. We're not as inclined to compete over global empire. No one's, if the Chinese idea of global empire is the Senkaku Islands, and our idea of global empire is Helmand Province, we're not quite up there with the European colonial powers of 100 years ago. So I think if we are empire builders, we're both really bad at it.
Where's Neil Ferguson? Where's Neil Ferguson when you need him?
Exactly. On the other hand, the basic idea, if part of the lesson from World War I is you don't always want to be in a deterrence model, but you also sometimes want to be in a spiral prevention model. You don't want to get into that reaction, counter-reaction, where you're both sort of maintaining your resolve and therefore getting into an escalatory process. I think World War I has a lot to tell us. I think there's a distinct possibility that China is, Germany, and we're the UK or what have you. And I don't mean Hitler's Germany, I mean the Germany before World War I, a country that felt its oats and sort of had a right to expect a little more, given the way it had coalesced and brought things together. And we've got to expect that this is, to some extent, a law of nature, a law of human nature, and a law of international relations, that rising powers expect greater influence. And they will pursue it, and they will find one way or another to attain it. So the debate is, how do you respond to that? And some people would say, just get in China's face, another containment strategy. I think that's too simple, because the Chinese have a certain amount of history to justify the idea that they deserve a little more place under the sun than they used to have. And as Kissinger's book, a fantastic book, underscores, even if it finishes slightly too pro-China for my taste even. But nonetheless, for the Chinese, they had a lost century, a century during which we and all of our friends beat them down. And even if, all those other countries were not our friends at the time, collectively, the Western Alliance beat the heck out of them for a century, and now they're finally coming back. And they've restored the, sense that China's the greatest country. And even if we don't quite concede that point, per se, they're going to expect a greater role in the international system. So what that means, let's hope that they keep defining their role to mean, responsible stakeholder, to use Zellick's term, another major power that has a great interest in the global economic system, and that ultimately helps us uphold it. And to the extent they define their interests that way, that's great. To the extent it takes them a while to get there, we've got to keep pushing back whenever they go in the wrong direction. But we've got to push back as gently as possible, in a gentlemanly way, as to the extent possible, so as not to provoke this reaction, counter-reaction. I'm not trying to say we should always try to just get along with them and always try to sweet-talk them, but I am saying we got to avoid escalatory dynamics on the military side.
I'm going to call on Professor Takeuchi, who's a Japanese national, but a specialist and a scholar of China.
Thank you very much for a very informative and stimulating talk. My question is about the Japan's roles in your picture of U.S.-China relationship. In 2008, Jim Steinberg came to SMU to give a keynote speech in a conference on Japan, and he emphasized the importance of Japan for the United States. And I asked the question, which I tried to make a little bit provocative, saying that I understand for US, China is important, but I'm not sure whether Japan is important for the United States. And his answer was, Japan is very important for the US to deal with China. So my question is, what roles would the United States expect Japan to play in China-US relationship?
It's a great question, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue with you, I hope, in the years ahead. It's such a complex question that I want to be succinct, but let me just say two things to avoid going off in many different directions. First of all, I tend to think Japan's instincts on how to handle the East Asian security environment are very good. And we Americans need to listen to Japanese because there are times where we may get a little forward-leaning on certain security issues. And I think the fact that Japan, since World War II, has had a very non-military tradition in many ways has been very healthy. And similarly, I think it's good that the Koreans and the Australians have a role of trusted ally, but where they don't necessarily give us a blank check in advance about using bases on their territory for any possible future conflict with China, they want to weigh in on that too. So that's my overall point. However, right now, I think the roles are reversed. I think right now we're being more cautious and Japan's being more aggressive. And I think Japan is actually needing to listen to some American counsel for restraint. Because the Senkaku Islands just aren't worth it, my friend. and I'm not suggesting that you believe they are. But here's the way I would put it. If the Chinese take the Senkaku Island, and it would be so stupid, but let's say they might. I'm not prepared to rule out stupidity as a characteristic of human behavior. I don't want my war-fatigued military to go liberate those islands for you. I'm not interested that much in, and I don't mean to say for you, but for our Japanese friends, because I've had this debate a lot recently with Japanese friends. You can see how I'm falling back into that mode. The basic idea, as you know, we've had a lot of debate. Does the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty cover the Senkaku Islands? Even though the United States takes no position on who should own the Senkaku Islands. But because Japan now administers them, we agree that the treaty, at least temporarily, covers them. And then Japanese friends sometimes interpret that to mean that if the Chinese take those islands, that we should come take them back. That's not what a mutual defense treaty necessarily means. It doesn't require you to respond symmetrically. And I know the Admiral and a lot of other people could weigh in on this question. I'm not suggesting we should take options off the table. But right now, I've been getting worried lately, at least through the summer into the early fall, that Japanese wanted to sort of pick more of a fight on this issue. Now, in the last couple of weeks, as I said earlier, it sounds like it was the Japanese and my good friend Satoshi Morimoto, the defense minister with whom we did a book at Brookings 15 years ago, who has said to the Americans, calm down, let's not do that simulated amphibious invasion of the Senkakus because it's just not worth the provocation. So maybe it's good when we listen to each other. Maybe that's the best thing I can say to conclude. Because I think in this particular case, we're going to need to find ways to be tough, but also show restraint. And getting that right is always going to be hard. So I think the alliance is important because both sides need to sometimes give the other some advice they need to hear.
Yeah, I know we got a lot of questions on the table. I'll try to get as many of them as we can. We don't get Mike O'Hanlon out here that often, so let's try to take advantage of him. Is it Scott Miller who has a question? No? Oh, over here. Yes, this lady over here.
Oh, sorry.
And then we'll go to Bill Barnett over here and Barry Crossman. Anyone else?
Hi, my name is Christina. I'm an engineer at Lockheed Martin, and I found it kind of interesting that we have been increasing weapon sales to Taiwan. And I wanted to know your opinion on how does that affect our U.S.-China relationships?
Well, you know, people could be interested either by the sales or by the lack of more sales, right? And as you're well aware, because what we've tried to do is find the Goldilocks option. Not too much and not too few, not too hot and not too cold, because as I understand the latest, we've been agreeing now to upgrade some of their existing F-16 stock, but not to sell them a lot more new F-16s. And we have agreed in principle to help them find somebody to build submarines, except nobody in the world We'll build those submarines for them, with the possible exception maybe of the Chinese, right? If they do it straight, or the Russians. Just teasing. But basically, our European friends who used to build very good diesel submarines are typically out of the business now. We don't build diesel submarines, so we have this agreement in principle. The Taiwanese should get more diesel submarines, but we can't figure out how to get them built. And that's sort of, the F-16s, the submarines, these are good examples of where we've been on this question. We're trying to get just the right balance. Meanwhile, everyone recognizes the trend line, which is that Taiwan is no longer holding its own vis-a-vis China in any way, militarily. And again, as people in this room know well, for a long time our strategy was keep Taiwan with that technological advantage, and also the 100 miles of water between China and Taiwan used to be a lot greater distance than it is now, if you see what I mean, and I think you know what I mean. And so as the Chinese have gotten good at precision strike technology, and as the Chinese economy has just leapfrogged, and as the Taiwanese have actually let their defense budget decline more than I would have guessed under these circumstances, and as the United States has tried to find this balance, I'm actually struck that we haven't sold them more. But I'm fairly comfortable with where we are right now. I think as much as anything, you're trying to send a political message that we're still very interested in Taiwan's security, but we're not necessarily under any illusions that Taiwan could defend itself anymore.
Okay, we're going to take three very quick last questions. Should we gather the questions,
Sure,
maybe?
let's do it that way.
So let's do Bill, this gentleman here, and then Barry gets the last question. So
I
Bill, go
plan
ahead.
to go on for about 6 minutes, but I'll try to make it quick, Jim. I'm going to ask a bridging question between this and the first roundtable.
Right.
General scales, you mentioned the idea of balanced forces. I think you mentioned it 4 times, if I was counting right. I wonder if that makes sense. I'm going to try to debate. I'd like to ask Michael to respond to that because it seems to me that is a choice to prepare equally well for everything rather than to pick a couple of things and really focus our preparation for it. And so I have 2 questions. Number 1, do you like the idea of balanced forces versus preparing for multiple scenarios? And number 2, if we decided we really wanted to prepare for a war with China, how would the defense budget change over the next 5 or 10 years?
Oh, such easy, soft questions here at the end. Yes, this gentleman right back here, and then we'll go to Barry. Yeah.
I'll make mine very short. With China, when you spoke about dividing in half, and you acknowledge that this is complex, so I'm not putting words in your mouth. Those of us who focus on counterterrorism are concerned about China's move into the Middle East, which is not explicitly military, it's domestic, but has military implications for keeping us tied up there. So I just, you could maybe comment on that.
And finally, Barry. Here, Barry, use this one.
Talking about perspective, and you mentioned the historical perspective of China, and just having recently reread the Deng Xiaoping biography, I think it's important for us to really step back and say, look, here's where China was in 1976 to 1980 when Deng first came back for the 3rd time. And look how far they've come. Look at the number of changes. It took us 100 years or so to make that many changes. And trying to provide them the space, especially regarding the role of the PLA in the system in China. You remember if you go back to Thailand and how the Thai army was involved in all kinds of different enterprises, et cetera. Well, the PLA was doing the same thing. And I think that China is wrestling with what is the role of the PLA in their economy. And I think it will change quite drastically over the next 10 to 20 years.
Yeah, on the last point, since that was a good comment, and I don't need to respond in detail, I would simply say that, of course, it could change for better or for worse. And I was glad very much that the Admiral made the point earlier about the independent thinking and influence of the PLA and the power it has. And one thing we're going to have to watch is how well the PLA does in national decision-making under a leader who is seen as being very friendly to the PLA. That could be good or bad from our point of view. Good or bad from the point of view of civilian control of the military. We'll just have to watch that one. And I think on these other 2 questions, I can partly lump them together, which is good because they sort of pertain to the same issue. I'm a big fan of this guy and everything, including on this topic. And by the way, if you haven't read his Foreign Affairs review essay on Tom Rick's new book, you have to. It's brilliant. And I've read a lot of Bob Scales over the years. This might be my favorite single thing of all. So it just came out. Read it. But anyway, on balanced forces and the Middle East, it's sort of the same answer. You know, if you read the Obama plan, and I'm an Obama supporter, but if you read the Obama plan from last winter, and I think Bob Scales wrote about this too, it has a little bit of a wishful quality to it, right? We declare the era of large-scale counterinsurgency over. Well, isn't that nice? It's nice that, that we've just decided what the future character of wars will be. And by the way, and again, I like the Obama budget better than the Romney or the Ryan budget, but wasn't it funny that the president took credit for not overspending on future wars as a deficit reduction thing that he could count in his current budget? So I'm not even kidding, not even exaggerating. But on this point, enough teasing aside of our friends back home in Washington, on this point, the Middle East is still very turbulent. And while I don't think it's very likely the United States is going to send another 100,000 plus strong force into any country, the idea that we can permanently exclude the possibility of a large-scale stabilization mission in Syria forever, I don't think is realistic. The idea that we don't really need to worry about Yemen except to the extent that Admiral McRaven can handle it with special forces, I don't think that's necessarily realistic. This is a place from which we almost got attacked several times. And we're hoping that the internal politics and civil conflict within Yemen push things in a favorable direction. What if we're wrong? And we're not out of Afghanistan yet. And by the way, this is something that's easier to say among friends off the record, but I think it's nice that we have an in extremis capability to overthrow the Iranian regime just in case. Not because we would ever do it, but because it's good that the Iranians not be able to rule that possibility out. So for all these reasons, when I say I could live with the Army and Marine Corps being a little smaller than in the 90s, that's what I mean, a little smaller, a few percent smaller, certainly no more than 10% smaller, and probably more like 5% smaller. So this doesn't get you to huge defense budget savings.